Despite the challenges of coronavirus, 2021 has been a big year for tennis. But despite everything that's happened in the tennis world, the year will be remembered for one big thing that didn't happen.
Yeah, this was the year that Japanese tennis star, and self-declared introvert Naomi Osaka refused to take part in a post-match press conference.
And sadly, she actually had to withdraw from the Paris Open in order to make sure that she didn't have to face up to those tough questions from the press.
Naomi Osaka said the way journalists quizzed players at the press conferences adversely affected her mental well-being.
And it's fair to say that those tough and often nasty questions that come out at post-sporting press conferences and in other places typically come from people called extroverts.
And it's also fair to say that away from tennis, there's much that can be done to help the interaction between introverts and extroverts to go more smoothly and lead to greater harmony,
And greater communications.
greater understanding, and
Greater productivity.
productivity. So, in the second half of this session, I'll be asking a media expert who happens to be an extrovert what introverts can do to more confidently stand up to media questions, however tough and personal those questions might be.
And in the first half of this session, I'll be asking an expert on introverts, who happens to be an introvert, what can be done to help those introverts who seem sometimes to be reluctant to take part in professional conversations and want to be able to do so with more confidence and more competence. So, John Baker, out of all those people out there who are not introverts, what do they need to know about introverts in order to sometimes entice them to actually say a bit more and say it a bit more happily when the introvert seems to be a bit reluctant?
I'm going to answer that question in a moment, Michael, because I think it's a really good question. However, I want to pick up on one word, the word reluctant. Now, you very nicely put seems to be reluctant, but I've often heard introverts that told they're reluctant to speak up, and it's not the case. So I want to park that point. I want to really make that strongly that it's not about being reluctant. It is about being introverted. And then perhaps some more of that will come out as we chat. But coming back to your question, I think the first thing we need to understand is about introverts. So what can I talk about? I'm going to talk about processing. I'm going to talk about energy. And to me, those are two of the important things about introversion. So processing, the way people think, typically, introverts will use what I would call internal processing. They think to talk, whereas an extrovert will talk to think. Now, that can be very confusing if you fire a question at an extrovert and words come tumbling back out of their mouth, and that's their way of thinking through the problem. Whereas an introvert asks them the question and they'll think for a minute or two or a few seconds, and they'll try and come back with the most complete, the most structured, the best answer they can before they talk. Now, that can lead to a slight gap in the conversation. And the other thing is about energy and people energy, because if introverts spend a lot of time with other people, they're liable to feel de-energized, whereas extroverts typically will grow and almost glow and absorb energy from the room when they're with lots of other people. So I think it was important to touch on those, but then what could you do? The first thing I often talk about in a business setting is advanced questions. Now, I get that all journalists can't send the questions over in advance, because unless they fixed the tennis match, for example, you couldn't possibly say, so Naomi, why did you win or lose or whatever? So that is a difficult point. But the advanced question one is an incredibly useful feature, because if the introvert's having to process and think about that best structure, if they know the question in advance, they're more likely to speak more quickly.
So when faced with a situation where you've got lots of extroverted journalists facing someone like Naomi after a match, whether she's won or not, what should they be doing as far as perhaps the way they ask their questions in order to make her feel more happy about actually answering them, whether they're tough questions or not?
I think one of the first things is to not overtalk. So one of the features of that gap quite often is that the introvert will stop and think. Extroverts tend not to like gaps in the conversation and will jump in and fill them. And quite often I've seen it that they take the gap as I'm not really answering it. And so they jump in and fire another question. Well, that's not really going to help. And what that says to, actually, it says, I'm going to say it says to the introvert, but he would say it to anybody in that situation. It says, you're not interested in my answer. So why the hell would I bother with it? So don't overtalk. Give people a bit more time to respond.
And when it comes to, sorry, I'm doing exactly what
absolutely
extroverts are meant to do, interrupting you, but it was such a good point, I wanted to pick up on it. And that is, when it comes to the question, even if it's a tough question like, is this the end of your career because you lost that match so badly or something like that, is there something in the way that they inject some sort of tone of warmth or something into it, which could actually make an introvert happier to answer it?
I don't think that there's a way of asking a really horrible question in a nice way to anybody, if I'm completely honest. If it's a really hard question, first of all, I'm going to come back to what I think was really the issue here. It was picked up initially that Naomi was an introvert. Actually, later on, out of it came that it was making her suffer from some kind of mental fatigue, whatever we want to call it. And I think that was much more the issue. So I think sometimes we've got to say, what are the questions and do we really need to ask them?
And is it fair to say that sometimes non-introverts mistake as anxiety actual introversion itself, and when the introverts may well not be anxious at all?
I think that's completely fair. I mean, if you sit there and think about, firstly, the energy thing. If I'm feeling de-energized, if you're feeling absolutely knackered, Michael, you probably wouldn't want to go and be interviewed. Now, if I'm already feeling de-energized just because I've been with a lot of people, I don't have a huge enthusiasm for going and meeting more. And then knowing that when I get asked these questions and expected to come up with brilliant answers on the spot, and bear in mind, society today expects more and more brilliance on the spot, however unfair that might be, knowing that that's going to be the case, knowing the fact that as an introvert, I might lead a slight gap in the conversation, and that might make me feel more anxious. It doesn't mean that I am anxious. It might give that appearance.
And is there something that introverts can reasonably do to avoid giving that appearance without actually becoming extroverts?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think the first thing is to prepare, and that's an introvert super strength. We can prepare. So think about the questions that are likely to come up. Think about the type of answers you're likely to want to give, and think about the structure. And maybe if you know that you're going to be interviewed and it's an important interview, to consult an expert such as yourself so that they can say, how should I best handle this type of question? But a lot of preparation. Introvert strength number one. Introvert strength number two, listen. Really listen to the question. Because very often the words, the first couple of words are not the real question. The real question comes in underneath that. So prepare and listen. But then I think there's a third one, which actually you taught me, Michael, which is what I would call a holding statement. So if I know that I have this gap while I'm thinking, if I could have a holding statement I can throw straight back out that makes you hold back for a moment, then that can work well. So that's a great question, Michael. And I've got 3 things I really need to tell you about that I've just discovered today.
You're an excellent student, John. Well done for remembering that.
You did remember. That's good.
So as a reward, you can ask me anything you like about media matters from the perspective of introverts.
Yeah, so now let's focus then on how to help introverts face up to challenging media questions. But just before that, I actually want to go, is it right? You know, remember back to that tennis situation, and my initial reaction was that people are paid to be interviewed. So tough, get on with it. And initially, to my shame, I didn't have a huge amount of sympathy. But then in the same week as that came out, there was an interview with Keira Knightley and another actress, and I can't remember who she was. And it was all about the pressure that people are put under in the film industry to appear, shall we say, more naked than they might wish to. And I sat there and thought about that a bit more. And so I'm thinking, if I was a budding star of any sport, I'm going to accept, whether willingly or not, a certain amount of pressure. And I just wonder if the two are similar. Is it fair that we ask questions like this straight after the match?
Well, it's a practical thing for journalists who are quick to need to get their stuff to air in their post-match reports. They've got to get something for the next news bulletin. There may be a sort of a news current affairs program afterwards that they need to provide material for. So the journalists do have to act quickly. And so sad to say for introverts and extroverts, that's just kind of the way it is. However, there's a lot that you can do if you're in the sports world or in the business world where you've actually got to perform quickly. And that is when you're doing your preparation in advance to actually work through all the possible scenarios. So let's move away from sport to a big business contract or negotiations about it, where the contract may be signed by both or it may not. And either way, it's a big story. So my advice is that people, whether they're introverts or not, if they're going to have to talk to the press soon after the decision's been announced, or actually at the announcement, they need to have been prepared for it. So they're ready for the why didn't the contract work out questions, and for why is the contract working out questions. And you need to be ready for both, so that when it comes to the crunch and you're in the spotlight, you are prepared for both. And as you say, introverts are quite strong on preparing, so I very much urge them to do so for the scenarios that could unfold.
So that would improve, that would maximize their chances of performing well in interviews. What should they do when facing press conferences where the questions come from a whole bunch of journalists?
Well, the number one thing you have to realize about that situation is what typically happens after tennis matches and others, is that there's a kind of collective group personality of the journalists, and they're tending to sort of ask often the same or similar questions. And also, if they're not getting the answer they collectively want, they are following up almost as if they're one person. They're sort of working together in order to get what they see as being the best, most useful material
So it's
for
almost
their
like
audiences.
like a pack mentality of a sort. Then would it be fair to say that, or it certainly seems to me sometimes, that some interviews start well and they carry on going well. Some start well and then something triggers it and it gets into a much more pressured situation where the interviewee is really struggling, and it's almost like people sense blood and really go for it. Is there something that they can do to stop that sensation of?
Yeah, you're right that the journalists, they're like a shark pack in some cases, scenting blood in the water. And as a diver, I'm sure you'd appreciate that there's not a lot you can do to stop them, but you can be prepared for it. I suppose the number one thing I would advise to introverts in particular, and to others as well in that situation, when you're the person who is in the spotlight, is don't take the questions personally. That moment you speak about where suddenly things are going well and then suddenly they're not, is often because someone in the spotlight is being a bit brittle and someone asks them a question and they take it personally, and the whole tone of the conversation changes. I remember one in particular, it is from the sporting world, where Australia was playing England in something called the Ashes. And that's something that, for those who know a bit about cricket, Australia usually win, but sometimes they
sure
don't.
About that.
And on this particular recent occasion, what happened was that I was the Australian Broadcasting Corporation representative at the post-match press conference when Australia lost the Ashes. And Ricky Ponting was the Australian captain. And I sort of felt duty bound to ask him a tough question, which was, Ricky Ponting, have you considered resigning as a result of this defeat? And he took it personally. He sort of snarled and snapped, and it did change the press conference tone, which wasn't going to be great for him anyway.
So that's what
I managed to get the question in really early, and so the rest of it was very combative, not just between me and Ricky, but between the other journalists as well.
So sometimes the reaction to a question can put the blood in the water than the shark pack go for. So how should introverts react to tough personal questions, which may seem, and probably are, designed to provoke them?
Yeah, well, if you are provoked, then you're probably losing and the press are winning. When I'm advising people how to deal with the press in those situations, you don't want to give the press a free win. So you've got to be a little bit more clinical about it and perhaps slightly more detached in your head. So if you're explaining why you played badly, don't think of it so much as I'm making this confession for me personally and I'm destroyed by this. You can be a bit more like a sort of sporting commentator and just explain in a way that the press will be interested in, what actually happened, what was going through your mind. I mean, the press love those kind of, love asking those kind of questions. And if an introvert can give a really good answer to it, but without, getting sulky or thinking, I don't want to ever appear before the press again, then it's a win for them and a win for the media and a win for the wider audience. So
And I think
it
there's a
is something you can actually plan, prepare, and practice for in media training sessions.
And I think it's a great point you raised there. You mentioned the sulky thing, and certainly introverts are no more likely to be sulky than extroverts or anybody else. So yes, trying to avoid the personal bit. And would it be fair to say that if I can give you a very quick answer and then follow into more detail and keep it unpersonalized, as you just said, that would work well?
Yeah, and you're right that it's not just introverts who fall into that trap. I mean, let me take a well-known extrovert, a guy called Donald Trump, who we don't hear quite as much about these days as we used to. But like some extroverts, and I suppose he's an extreme case, he can be a bit brittle if someone is questioning his competence or sanity or whatever. He repeatedly made press conferences far worse for himself by taking offense. And so it's not just introverts who need to plan, prepare, and practice and be a bit more dispassionate in these situations. Extroverts can sometimes need to do it as well.
Is it all right if introverts take a while after a question is asked before coming up with their answers? It's something I mentioned earlier.
I would say you can take a little while, and that can actually add to your credibility because the journalists and the wider audience are thinking, oh, this person is really thinking about this. That's good. But sometimes when people are under pressure or they appear as though they're under pressure, they can just take a bit too long. And as you said, extroverts in the media packs don't like sort of gaps, and they're likely to jump in and ask an even tougher question on the same theme. So this is where I would come back to the basic premise of media training, which is plan, prepare, and practice, and try to think ahead even before the match. What are the kind of things I'll be saying if I lose, or what are the kind of things I'm going to say if I win, and think them out and be ready for those scenarios so that there are things in your head that you can potentially pick out at the press conference to say in order to help you through it. Let me give you another sporting example from the world of rugby, where I and a colleague were working with rugby league players, and there was a particular problem the team had, which was that their defense often wasn't as good as they wanted. Now, they used to get pilloried at press conferences before we came along, and we tried to change their negative into a positive, which was to talk about not so much that our defense was terrible, but in training, they were actually putting a lot of effort into improving their defense. And it was getting better, although they were a lot better at attacking than defending, but they were improving on defense, working on defense. So we got them to say things like, and you can plan this ahead, if you have a loss and it was a defensive error that caused it, they could be saying things like, we're doing everything possible to strengthen our defense, or we're trying to turn our defense into the best part of our game. So, you can always be saying what you're trying to do, and you can think that out before the game. Now, obviously, I'd prefer sports people to be going in thinking we're going to win the game, and then at the press conference, we'll be talking about the great win. But being realistic, you have to know that occasionally it doesn't always go your way, and you have to be ready for the defeat kind of questions. And as much as anyone, if you're a sporting person, you know what they're going to be. And if you're in business, in the world of high stakes and wins and losses, you know also what the negative questions are going to be if you think about it. And I say if you plan for it, then you can look so much smoother and more confident and cut out those sometimes embarrassingly long gaps before you come out with your great answer.
And I think that's a really good point. And I think the other thing you did very neatly there is remind us that this isn't just about sports stars. This is about people in business. This is about people in business, whether they're MDs in large corporates or they're running their own small business with 10, 20 people, because there are always times when we get interviewed by the media or interviewed by anybody, and great interviewing techniques are incredibly useful to know whether you're introvert or extrovert. So perhaps back to you, Michael.
Yeah, and it's important whether it's a big business or a smaller business. The bigger businesses generally think, well, yes, we know we're going to get in the media, so we have to be ready for it. And so, I and my colleagues do quite a bit of training in that area. The smaller businesses sometimes take the view, and they're entitled to it, but it's often not wise. It's like, well, we're just hoping the media never notice anything we do. And they're losing out there if they're doing something that could be positively presented to the media, which a lot of things can if you're trained right to get that positivity across. And so my suggestion is in the business world, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, and whether your business is small or large or somewhere in between, that the media training is good, not just if something goes terribly wrong and the factory blows up or something, and you're there facing the media explaining what's happening, but also for when good things happen. And, most of your time in business, you're spending trying to make good things happen for your customers and for the wider world. So if you are media trained there and you learn how to face up to the tough questions, which you'll get even on positive stories, then you and the business are in a much better place.
And I guess if you therefore can get some training, and if you can work together and you can demonstrate what works well in interactions, perhaps with introverts and extroverts, and what works well, what doesn't work well, and help everybody draw out the important lessons.
Absolutely. And, it's great to draw attention to the introvert-extrovert combination in that, because obviously in a mainstream firm, you're going to have mixture of introverts and extroverts. And there's things that we can both do to help them communications-wise, internally and externally. But also some industries tend to attract predominantly one lot or the other. I mean, if you look at the entertainment industry, they're predominantly extroverts. If you look at TV, you walk into a BBC studio, they're all extroverts, or they seem to be. But if you walk into an accountancy firm, as you and I quite often do, it's not quite the same. You're dealing with, and often the first thing I notice is, my goodness, it's quiet here. Everyone's diligently working away. But even even introverts. I mean, even anyone of any level of competence in the business can be, trained to put the company's message across, whether introvert or extrovert. And there's a lot of overall confidence that you get from the process, particularly if you're on the perhaps slightly quieter introvert side. You can actually improve your self-confidence if you do go through the media training and the communications training in order to bring out the best, strongest side of yourself at the right time.
And I guess it would be really good if your training encompassed a couple of trainers, one of which was very much media and extrovert biased, and one of which was much more of an introvert. And I guess that could work
it's
well.
good for that, because you can play the kind of good cop, bad cop routine.
So how could people get hold of an extrovert that might be prepared to run a session like that, Michael?
Well, if they're really extroverted, they can just pick up the phone and get on to me. And if they're more introverted and perhaps they prefer to talk in the first instance to an introvert, perhaps you could give some advice there, John.
Yeah, absolutely. You can email me if you're an introvert. And in the footnotes of this piece of video, there is my email address and even Michael's phone number.
Everything you could possibly need.
Absolutely.
So it's probably time to say goodbye from you.
Yep, whatever your challenge, we'd love to help. Certainly goodbye from me.
And goodbye from him.